if we're going to start thinking about how a monopolist is going to operate in a market and what the market and welfare outcomes will be when we have a monopolist, we first need to start and think a little bit about their story about their revenue. So we can think back to our 4 assumptions that we made about a monopolist, and the punchline from those is that we end up with a monopolist that has control over market prices, right? When you think about contrasting this with a perfectly competitive market, whereas we had a bunch of small firms that had no control over market prices, they had no ability to influence the market. With a monopolist, because they're the only one, they're going to get to control exactly what the market price is, but subject to market demand, subject to consumer demand, right? We can think about, because this monopolist faces this downward sloping demand curve, it means that they get to choose through their output what the price will be. But that doesn't mean they get to charge whatever price they want. If they wanted to charge a price of $4 million, they're not going to be able to accomplish that, right? They raise prices because we have a downward sloping demand curve. They're going to lose all their customers. So they do have an ability to control market prices, but it still is subject to this idea of consumer demand. We can think about, what if we had a demand equation that looks something like this. Notice it's familiar y equals mx plus b format, except instead of y, we've got price that we measure vertically, and we've got q that we measure horizontally. So we've got a vertical intercept of 100 and a negative 10 for a slope. If we jump back to this demand curve, right, we could think about, yep, that would correspond with that equation if we had 100 as my vertical intercept, and it looks like I've got a negative 10 slope. If we use this equation, we can think about, what are all the different prices and the associated quantities that consumers would want to purchase, right? At a price of 100, this monopolist is not going to sell anything. If you take P equals 100 and substitute 100 in for P and solve for Q, Q equals 0. Well, that makes sense, right? At a price of 100, you don't have any customers. 2 other ideas to throw on here: total revenue and marginal revenue. Total revenue, if you recall, is just price times quantity. So if you price it at $100, you're not going to sell anything, so you have no money coming in. If instead you price the product, or this monopolist prices the product at $90, they will sell a unit. If they price it at $80, they'll sell 2 units. Notice there's this inverse relationship between prices and quantity. As prices fall, quantity is going to get higher and higher and higher. We can think about taking all those prices and quantities, the associated total revenue with the different levels of production. Marginal revenue then, right, is how much the revenue increases when we have a change in production. When we don't produce anything, total revenue is nothing. When we produce that first unit, total revenue went up by $90. Producing that second unit of output, total revenue went up by $70. Whoops, by $70, right? Marginal revenue tells me the change line by line in total revenue. And notice a couple of patterns between these 4 variables. We can think about, when quantity increases, that's us moving down this column, right? When quantity increases, prices are going down. When quantity increases, total revenue has this pattern that we've seen before, where it increases up to its midpoint, and then it starts decreasing, right? It starts decreasing down in that inelastic portion. Well, that also means that marginal revenue, right, starts out very, very, very high, but then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually, after it gets into the inelastic portion, will even become negative, 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 negative. I want to do a little bit of side note on algebra. So if you like math and you've had calculus, stick with me. If not, jump over 30 seconds or so. So if you think about having a demand equation like this that has a vertical intercept of 100 and a slope of negative 10q, we can think about how we could use this to come up with total revenue. If you recall, total revenue is price times quantity, and so we could substitute this price equation in for P, and we've got 100 minus 10q times q, price times quantity, right? If we distribute the q through, then we've got an equation for total revenue that's 100q minus 10q squared. If you notice, and you've had calculus, all these marginals that we're doing, they're really just derivatives, right? So marginal revenue has got to be the derivative of the total revenue equation with respect to q. If you remember your calculus, how do we take the derivative of that equation with respect to q? The 100q becomes q, and the negative 10q squared bring down the exponent, multiply it by the coefficient, reduce the exponent by 1, and we end up with negative 20q. This is what everyone needs to remember. Here's the punchline. For a linear demand curve, notice the relationship between marginal revenue and that demand equation. Marginal revenue, it's got the same slope, the same price intercept, but twice the slope. Sorry, the same price intercept, the same vertical intercept, and twice the slope. Notice, for my demand equation, the vertical intercept was 100. On this marginal revenue equation, the vertical intercept is 100. The slope of my demand curve was negative 10. The slope of my marginal revenue is negative 20. It's twice as much. Why does that matter? Well, if you recall, if we want to ask what should a firm do to produce, to maximize profit, the answer to that question is always where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That right there is the story that we need to remember. Always. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's profit maximizing. We want to think about this market and graphically what's the implication of having a monopolist. But I first want to think about what if instead of having a monopolist, what if we had a perfectly competitive market? Well, we've got our downward sloping demand just like the market that we considered in a perfectly competitive market. And now here's the other thing that we have to remember from last time. This is the marginal cost curve for a monopolist. What if the marginal cost curve for the monopolist was equal to the supply curve that we saw in a perfectly competitive market? Right? So under that setup, boy, I've got a supply curve, I've got a demand curve. Where do supply and demand intersect? Their intersection has a quantity component, and it also has a price component. And those are our old friends P star and Q star. Implicit in our notation, P star and Q star are the price and quantity outcomes that we get from having a perfectly competitive market. Now we want to ask what quantity, in the same setup, what quantity should the monopolist produce? Instead of having perfect competition, what if instead we had a monopolist, right? Go back a second. The monopolist, their marginal revenue has the same vertical intercept and twice the slope. If I look at this demand curve, if I draw a line that has the same vertical intercept and exactly twice the slope, that is the marginal revenue for the firm or for the monopolist. And notice my marginal revenue, I'm drawing it below my graph, right? This is technically when marginal revenue has gone below 0 and became negative, right? If we go back to our table, yeah, marginal revenue does become negative. Where does it become negative though? It becomes negative right at the midpoint of this demand curve. I know it's the midpoint because look right here, this horizontal intercept is half of this other horizontal intercept. So I know it's got twice the slope. Now we're just filling out the story. Where does marginal revenue equal to marginal cost? That's the quantity the monopolist should produce to maximize profit. So I look, where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? That is going to be the quantity the monopolist produces to maximize profit. And notice the monopolist is going to produce less than what a competitive market would produce. Why do they produce less than what a competitive market would produce? Because if I take my quantity up to the demand curve, that's going to tell me the prices that firms charge. Monopolists hold back their output so they can jack up the price of their product. Fundamentally, the monopolist wants to raise prices. They can get away with raising prices because they have no competition. But how do they get higher prices? Because they're the only ones in the market and face a downward sloping demand curve. The only way they can elevate prices is by artificially restricting output. They've done something to produce less than they otherwise would, than what we would get from a competitive market. So the other question that I'm going to leave for you to think about, we just went through what the market outcomes would be. Can you think about what the welfare outcomes would be? Right? Remember, our welfare outcomes are things like consumer surplus and producer surplus, and sometimes we even saw things like deadweight loss and tax revenue. I don't know if there's any tax revenue in this story, but you might want to stop and think for a little bit about, can you identify what consumer surplus and producer surplus would have been for a competitive market versus this monopoly market, and think about how those values have changed.